Hey guys, it's Matt Scott here and I've got another very exciting tutorial for you. Today I'm going to be talking about this special number here, a 4K, but what I want to cover as quickly as possible is a complete 4K workflow from ingest to edit, processing, color correction, finishing, and exporting to a deliverable. Now we're going to be doing this with these two lovely pieces of software here, especially EDIUS 7, which is now 64-bit, and a piece of free RED software which allows us to process some raw information. So I will be talking about resolution, but I also will be talking about processing raw footage as well. So let's jump straight into it and have a look at how RED cameras actually record resolution. If we take a look at this image, you can see in the green square we have an image I recorded at 4096 by 2160, which is 4K. Now 4K is a hell of a lot bigger than 1080p. 1080p is slightly smaller than this red image in the middle. Now it's great to compare sizes with this diagram, but it's also very useful to know that the RED camera, when changing resolutions, doesn't actually shrink an image down to fit a new resolution, it just crops the sensor. Now there are some pitfalls with this. I mean, when you crop a sensor, you obviously get a lens crop. So for example, when you're shooting 2K, you're actually cropping in at 3.25 times your focal length. In other words, a 50mm lens almost becomes a 150mm lens. When you look at this at 100%, and granted I did shoot this with a very sharp lens and I will stop down to f8, 100mm macro this was, we get some beautiful detail at 4K. But what's better than that is when you subsample a higher resolution image down to a smaller resolution. And this is exactly how other cameras work. We're also going to be looking at how subsampling can help in post and why it's always important to shoot at the highest possible resolution. Now let's just quickly compare. I mean, it's quite obvious to see the resolution differences here, but let's just quickly compare 4K to one of the highest resolutions we can currently watch in our homes right now, which is Blu-ray. Here's a screen grab from one of my favorite recent Blu-ray films, shot on RED of course, and you can really see the massive difference between this shot that I shot with my camera and a Hollywood feature film. It's 4 times smaller, and then even then it's been cropped top and bottom to be even smaller. But let's have a quick look at 100% and see the beautiful detail in this girl's hair and the beautiful detail that the RED camera actually captures. Now some of that detail is actually perceived detail, and it's an advantage of what's called subsampling, like I mentioned before. Now let's have a look at what I mean by subsampling. So I'll just quickly turn this off, and if we shift this to the side, I'm going to have a look at our 4K image, and I'm going to resize it myself. So 4K at 100% looks like that. I'm going to resize this down and match it to this 1920 by 1080p shot. You'll notice it's slightly longer than 1080p. Now the reason for that is because the RED camera shoots 4K, which is 4096 by 2160, but that's not exactly 16 by 9, it's more like a 16 by 10. But let's have a quick look at what subsampling does. Let's have a look at this at 100% now. Look how amazing this detail is. We have beautiful detail in the hair, and it's much nicer and much sharper than when we looked at 4K at 100%. This method of resizing or shrinking or subsampling has many benefits. One of them being is what we just saw now, which is perceived sharpness and detail. Another one is it actually shrinks the noise pattern. So if we do have noise in our shadows or we have a noisy image due to high ISO, it actually shrinks that noise pattern down, so then we have perceivably less noise as well. Now other high-end cameras work slightly different to the RED in that they actually do this subsampling in camera. Now the pitfall is you miss out on resolution, so you only end up with a 2K shot. But the beauties are like what we see here. But isn't it interesting to see the difference between 4K and 1080p? Now remember, this has shrunk even more if we place this on this image and we just cut out even more of our image to match what a Hollywood deliverable is. Look how much we're actually discarding of the image. So that's just a quick crash course on crop factors, how the RED works in terms of resolution, and what subsampling can do. Now this is great because I always shoot in the highest resolution possible. If I could shoot in 6K, I would, because I know that when I shrink it down, even to 4K, I'm going to get a much nicer image than if I did shoot at 4K originally. So why on earth would I be harping on about the benefits of subsampling when we're doing a 4K workflow? I mean, obviously, if we're starting with 4K, we're going to end with 4K, so there will be no subsampling. But what I want to demonstrate is how we can still maintain maximum quality the whole way through using EDIUS 7 and REDCINE-X. RED cameras record to their own proprietary media. Here is a RED mag. It's like an SSD drive. This is a 64 gig SSD, and it's $725. Quite expensive. And then we have our RED station reader, which is basically just a card reader for those RED mags. Now these are eSATA or USB 3, and if you're in the field, generally speaking, you'll be transferring footage with a laptop, right? Well, my laptop didn't have USB 3, and transfer speeds are crucial. Check out eBay, go there, type USB 3 express card, $20 gives you 2 USB 3 ports and completely transform your laptop. So get on that. I thought it was a great way to transform my little station. And the other thing to think about is compression ratios. Now the beauty of RED is it's actually not uncompressed. Shooting to an uncompressed format to me is a little bit ridiculous because basically uncompressed, yes, it contains the most information possible, but it's so ridiculously huge, which can be quite difficult to manage, but let's not forget storage space. Now, RED has created their own compression called RED code compression, and it's packed in a .r3d file. But if you go to red.com/tools, you'll find a whole bunch of useful tools, and one of them is this. So all you do is you type in your resolution, 4K. I'm going to record 6:1, which is the lowest the Scarlett can record at 4K. I'm going to record a frame rate of 24 frames per second, and I've got a 64 gig card, and if I press calculate, it tells me that each video file records 46 megabytes per second. At those settings. That's quite high, but it's actually much lower than uncompressed. And it's also going to give us an average of 24 minutes for that 64 gig card. So that's a really useful tool, and it gives you an idea of how big, but not necessarily big compared to uncompressed, RED footage is. There's another really useful tool at redtools.com, and that's the crop factor guide. So here we can say we're shooting at 4K and we've got a 100mm lens. What is the crop factor? So here is a full frame 35mm still frame, and at 4K on the RED with a 100mm lens, it's not actually going to cover that full frame. You're going to get quite a severe crop. And like I was saying earlier, the lower you drop your resolution, the larger the crop factor. I mean, look how ridiculous we're zoomed in here with a 100mm lens that should fill this whole frame, but at 2K we only see this small portion here. Now, like I said, there are pitfalls and benefits to having that crop factor. Obviously, we have a 324mm equivalent lens here at 2K, but like I was talking about earlier, I find it better to shoot at full resolution all the time and subsample down to that size. Obviously, benefits of shooting smaller crop factors with RED is your frame rate is able to go up. For example, 2K on a Scarlett allows me to shoot at 60 frames per second. So enough about RED cameras and enough about drag and drooling dream cameras. Let's have a look at the other major benefit of shooting with a camera like this, and that's the fact that we get to shoot RAW. But while you're here, just go straight to the support section and let's just quickly download REDCINE-X. So if we scroll down here to the right to software, release version 17.5, click I have read terms and conditions and download. REDCINE-X is free software that allows RED users to manipulate RAW footage. The whole reason I bought my RED camera was because it shot RAW. Yes, I was attracted to 4K, but really, I wanted to be able to manipulate my images to the highest possible grade, and I knew from the stills background that I have that having RAW was absolutely essential to do that. Recording in RAW format allows us to process our images with extreme flexibility and such a huge range of data. REDCINE-X is like Lightroom for video, and basically it's a software that comes free with a RED camera and allows you to process the footage in a 16-bit color space and allows you to manipulate things like curves, saturation, contrast, sharpness, white balance, even ISO. And these things we can do after we press record. Now the beauty of this is something you cannot achieve with other higher end cameras that do shoot to compressed formats. The RAW format is really a truly amazing feat, and the exciting thing is EDIUS 7 now has seamless integration with this workflow. Some other interesting things about shooting RAW is that the camera itself does apply a look. These two things, the color space and the gamma space, refer to how the image is processed on its original arrival. Now, if we use the camera default settings, which are red gamma 3, the default settings give us a much more pleasing looking image straight out of the box. But you definitely have more flexibility and more control using something like red log film, which saves highlights and recovers shadow detail. It does mean more work is required, but it also means you can get a much nicer image, and you have a lot more control over what parts of the image are exposed. With 16 bits of information per channel, we can really start pushing things in directions never possible with lower end cameras that record to, say, H.264 or compressed formats like that. RAW allows us to change day to night. Without compression artifacts, without banding. We can push colors way further than we ever thought possible, without banding or artifacting. It's awesome. So how do we integrate this into a 4K workflow? Well, let's go ahead and have a look at that now. Okay, so assuming you've just been out on a shoot and you've got a whole hard drive full of files, the first thing you want to do is not actually copy those files across. Maybe actually get them start copying, because it does take a while. But the first thing you want to do is create a folder structure. Now I'm going to call this 4K Red workflow, and here is the beginning of my folder structure. Inside of that folder I'm going to create a whole series of folders. Now I've actually created them earlier, and I use this as my own template, and I urge you to go ahead and build your own folder structure that suits you. So for me, I have sequences which hold my timelines, footage, audio, stills, titles, bits, renders, and some AAF stuff for DaVinci. But the point is that I have a structure that fits every single project. So now I'm ready to actually copy my footage into, guess what? The footage folder. Now you'll notice every single one of my folders has an MTS Films logo in it. Now, for EDIUS to recognize and bring in a folder automatically, you actually have to have something in it. So an empty folder like this one will not import. It's just something to keep in mind, and you can keep anything you like in there. I just keep a very low file size image in there for every folder, and then it automatically will import this stuff. So yeah, the next step is to copy the footage from your Red Mag into this folder. Once you finish copying, then we jump straight over to EDIUS 7. Now EDIUS 7 has been updated dramatically. It's now fully 64 bits, so it utilizes all of the cores on your CPU, had more access to memory, and basically just runs quicker. But it also opens up more possibilities for EDIUS and gives it a greater scope for future updates. So once you're inside EDIUS, just click on New Project. We're going to start a new project today. And there will be some presets here. However, I'm going to create my own. So we have one here called 4K Full. Although you may not have one of those, it doesn't matter. Just click on any one of the presets available. Before we do that, let's name our project, and we'll call it 4K RAW or 4K Workflow. Now, there's a create folder within project, so that's going to create an extra folder within those default folder structures that I had, and that's all fine. But the important one here is to remember to click Customize. Let's press OK. If we open the Advanced tab, now we have access to everything we need to know about our project. The two most important ones being frame size and frame rate. Now, especially the frame rate, you have to make sure that you get your frame rate correct at the very beginning, because you can't change the frame rate later on. Everything else we can change, but the frame rate must be consistent. Now, all the footage that I'll be showing you today was shot at 23.98, so we'll leave it at 23.98. Now, the frame size is 4096 by 2160, so it supports full 4K resolution. Now, there's a little bit of confusion about what the difference between Ultra HD and 4K is. Well, 4K is literally 4096 by 2160. Ultra HD is 4 times 1920 by 1080. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's just quickly grab the old calculator out. And if we go 1920 times 2, we get 3840 width. If we go 1080 times 2, we get 2160. So Ultra HD is 4 times 4 actual screens of 1920 by 1080. 4096 by 2160 is slightly wider, like you saw in that resolution example at the beginning. We are going to stick with the maximum resolution, however, and we'll just quickly go through some of these other settings. So, video channels. Do we need to have alpha channels in this project? No, we don't particularly, but we can always change that later on. The video quantization bitrate. Most video cameras record in an 8-bit color space. RED records at 16-bit. So the highest bit depth your editor will accept is definitely the one you want to choose. Fortunately, EDIUS supports full 10 bits per YUV channel. The pull down type we can just leave. Stereoscopic editing, I'll leave that to the 3D guy, but basically we can have full 3D support in EDIUS. The sample rate of the audio, we can leave that to 48. Audio channels 2. Quantization bitrate for audio is 24-bit. Now this part is also important over here, the track default. So by default I can say I want this project to have 4 video tracks. I don't want to use any video audio tracks. I don't want any title tracks, and I'm going to have 2 audio tracks. Now we can always change this later on, but I just like to start my project like this. Now the rendering format is also important. Grass Valley has their amazing award-winning HQX 10-bit video codec, which is comparable to ProRes or DNx HD, for example. The fact that we can choose a resampling method is something that's quite new to video editing. And we can choose Lancos 3 High Quality, which is the best resampling method for upscaling or downscaling your footage. So let's go ahead and press OK. Okay, so now we're in our project. All we need to do is right-click on the root folder of the bin and choose Open Folder. And then we simply navigate to where we created that folder structure and copied our footage. And in this case, I'm going to use a different one, but it does have the same folder structure. And I'm going to press OK. You'll see that RED footage actually imports very quickly, which is fantastic. The biggest problem though is that RED footage, when you press record on a RED camera, it actually records each clip to a separate folder. Now this can be quite annoying, especially when you want to see all of your footage at once. So luckily EDIUS has some great feature sets that allow us to manage our media. If we just click on that footage folder, right click and go search, or we could just press Ctrl F. All we need to do then is change the category to clip type, and video is already selected up the top. We just go add, press close, and now we have this search results folder with every single shot from the RED camera in there. Now that we have our RED footage in our bin and we're ready to start editing, it's a good idea to just save your project. So I'm going to press Ctrl S for save. Now next up I'm going to go to settings, system settings, and we're going to have a quick look at how RED works within EDIUS. If we click on the importer exporter section and go down to RED, this is where we can change the preview quality of RED. Now the awesome thing with RED footage is that even though it's 16-bit 4K, it does have the ability to change resolution to lower resolutions on the fly. This allows you to edit things in real time. Now EDIUS, generally speaking, edits every format in real time at its full resolution, but now that we're stepping up into 4K so quickly, especially 4K 16-bit, there is times when you will want to drop that resolution so you can edit things in real time. So I'm going to set mine to 1/8 resolution and press OK. So now you can see we can click on a clip, and 1/8 resolution on a 1080p monitor actually looks pretty damn good. In fact, it's great for editing, and you don't actually need to see that super fine detail that we're going to switch back to later on when we start color grading. Now if it's not playing back in real time on your monitor, just believe me that you can check this buffer down here, that it's actually increasing. So this is playing in real time at the correct frame rate, which is really important. I'll just trim that back a little bit, and I'll just grab another shot here. Just a quick one. This was actually on our way to a camping adventure. Once every year me and my family go away camping, which I absolutely love. And this is when I first got my camera, so I was very eager to test it out. So we pulled over on the side of the road and we found this awesome location. And yeah, then the guys were just curious about what the hell was down this hole. So I won't bore you with any more editing. Basically, I just want to cover the complete workflow. So I'm assuming you understand editing and how to use the software. But I do want to point out some of its key features. One of the major ones is that we've imported RED footage natively. We're editing it natively and in real time. But now what I want to do is show you how EDIUS and REDCINE-X are integrated seamlessly. Now, there's a quick shortcut that I did change in order to make this even more effective. So if we go up to Settings, User Settings, and we go to User Interface, Keyboard Shortcut. Then what we're going to look for is the word Open. And you'll see one here called Open the Original File of a Clip. I've changed the shortcut here to Control G. So all you need to do is click Assign, press Ctrl G or whatever shortcut you like, and then press Close and OK. Now I've chosen the letter G because I'm associating this shortcut in my brain with the word grade. Because now what we're going to do is grade this footage. So if I click on this clip and press Ctrl G, watch what magically happens. In about 3 seconds, REDCINE-X pops up. We can change things like ISO, white balance, and things like that. Let me just apply a quick grade to this shot. I'm just going to add some contrast. It's really interesting to see how much detail you've actually captured in a raw 16-bit file. Now unfortunately this was the first time that I'd shot with RED, so I was shooting at 320 ISO, which was limiting my dynamic range, but you still get a massive amount of detail there compared to what we saw earlier. Now I'm also going to up the saturation some, and I'm going to warm it up a little bit. Now if I go up here and just compare to the way it was shot on camera, you can see I've made quite a drastic difference there. Now this is the cool part. I just click on this once, press Alt-Tab to flick back to EDIUS, and check it out. The changes have instantly come across, and in real time I'm still editing even with those color corrections applied. So what about this next shot? Click on it, press Ctrl G for grade, and Alt-Tab back to REDCINE-X, and here we are at that clip. So when you're matching clips together, it can be quite tedious to have to do that by eye, like so, or just remembering how I graded that last shot. So ideally what you would want to do is save a grade. So what I'm going to do now is exactly that. Just add some contrast to this shot, add some saturation, and what I'm going to do is go up to this Name Looks preset and just press the plus button, and then you'll see hidden under here is Look 1. If I double click on that, I can now call it EDIUS Grade Ref. So now when I open up my next clip, I'll be able to drop that exact shot on. But once again, if we just click on this once, press Alt-Tab, the effects come straight across, and once again, we're editing in real time. Next shot, Ctrl G. Go back to REDCINE-X, throw EDIUS Grade Ref on, click on it once, press Alt-Tab, comes straight across. Now this shot obviously is a little bit less exposed, so I need to adjust the grade a little bit. So if I just flick back to REDCINE-X here, and I'll just play with that curve and take a little bit midtones, bring them up a little bit. And once again, click on the screen, Alt-Tab, instantly comes across. This is such a powerful and efficient workflow. But what's so awesome about it is that we're processing our film, in inverted commas, in a 16-bit environment in its full raw state. Then we're allowing EDIUS to access that information and have it displayed on the timeline in a 10-bit space. So now what we can do is use EDIUS's finer tools to do a fine color grade. Although REDCINE-X is really designed to process raw footage, it's not exactly a fine color grading suite that allows you to choose secondaries, create masks, etc. But what EDIUS allows you to do is exactly that. So not only is it a powerful NLE 4K real-time editor, but it's also a high-end color correction suite. Okay, so I'll drop this clip down on my timeline. Click on it once, press Ctrl G, and then just have a look at how to create that base grade in REDCINE-X. So I've got my gamma space set to red log film to enable maximum highlight protection and shadow detail retention. So now I'm going to crush those values back out again, but at least I have the control to do so. Add some contrast in here. And something like that, maybe a little less. And I'm also going to add some blue to the shadows, just to cool it off a little bit. And that's looking pretty good. I'll also up the sharpness to 2. So now if I press Alt-Tab, those settings come across directly into EDIUS, which is fantastic. So I'm going to press 1. I've set this up as a keyboard shortcut. I can also go View, Single or Dual mode. So I've just set that to 1 to have a single mode. And just reiterating that I do have my red import settings set to half resolution, because I am doing some fine color correction work now. So what do I want to do to manipulate this image further? I have processed it somewhat in REDCINE-X, but now I want to really take the viewer and get them to focus on certain parts of the image and really, do a fine color grade on here. I might just duck back into REDCINE. The settings just aren't looking right. Too much of a highlight on her face. That's a bit better. And just maybe the whole image should be toned down a little bit. That's looking better there. And now what I'm going to do is use a mask tool, so I'll go to Effect and drag a mask on here. Now EDIUS's mask tool is absolutely amazing in that it's an unlimited point mask tool, but it's also a Bezier point mask tool. So I can actually draw custom shapes any which way I like and then animate them further down here on the timeline. But for this instance I'm just going to do a much quicker example. What I want to do is pick up the highlights on this Adidas bottle and these shoes because they're an important part of the scene for the advert. If I grab the pen tool and zoom out of here a little bit, I'm just going to draw a simple mask that shines through here. And this is going to act like a separate shard of light to add emphasis to that area. If I go to softness, enable that, and soften it by about 500 pixels. Then what I can do in the filter of the inside of that mask, I can choose a YUV curve. Now if I open the properties of the YUV curve, and let's just bring this down here so we can see what's happening. You can see I'm adjusting everything inside of that mask. So I'm just going to increase the light just to help emphasize that area. And I'm also just going to crush the blacks a little bit to make the contrast really pop. So if you look at before and after, you can see I've made quite a difference there. Now this is something that you can't do in REDCINE-X. I'm going to press OK. Now what I've noticed is, because I've increased the brightness in this area only in the luminance channel, I've also lost a bit of saturation in the tiles, but I actually quite like that. I think I want my tiles to be more white than that yellowy colour. So I'm going to add another secondary colour correction, this time using the three-way colour corrector. Drag that on top. Now with the three-way colour corrector, we have access to blacks, mids and whites, just like any three-way colour corrector, but we also have a limiting tool which allows us to make secondary colour corrections. Now generally speaking, when I do tutorials, I try and teach the three-question method. What colour are the tiles, how bright are the tiles, and how saturated are the tiles, and then I slide these values around until I find it. But it is actually a hell of a lot easier to just click the colour range, enable all of these limiters, and then click once on the tiles. So now if we turn on our key, we can actually see the key that has been chosen. And if we hold down Shift and click, we're slowly introducing more parts of the tile. Then we can go into our hue and just expand the range slightly to help us get a more accurate selection of those tiles. We can also increase luminance to make sure the highest, brightest parts are selected, and also soften the edge of the shadow area until we start introducing other parts of that colour. Now that's looking pretty good as a rough guide for now, so I'm going to turn my key off, and I'm going to push a slight amount of blue into those highlights. So now my tiles match either side, and they look a lot cleaner when they're white instead of yellow. So I'm going to press OK. Next, my goal here is for the viewer to look straight at our hero, and I feel like she's a little bit out of focus, but now I want to add some emphasis and try and sharpen up just that section of the clip. So again, I'm going to go Effect, go down to Mask, double click on the mask properties, and just draw a rough oval around her and the two products to her left. Now what I can do is soften that mask by about 450 pixels. And on the inside of the mask, I'm going to add a sharpness filter. I'm going to increase sharpness all the way up to 25. Now when working in 4K, I found that 25 is an acceptable amount of sharpness to add, depending on the shot of course. On the outside of that filter, however, I'm going to add the opposite of sharpness. So here we have a mask with sharpness inside of it that's been blurred by 450 pixels. Remember, in 4K, 450 pixels ain't all that much, just to keep that in mind. So I might actually increase that to 800 pixels. On the outside of the filter, I'm going to enable that. And now I'm going to add the opposite of sharpness, which is blur. But EDIUS 7 has this beautiful new Gaussian Blur, or Gaussian Blur, depending on how you pronounce it. The Gaussian Blur, the way I like to pronounce it, is so much better than the previous blur. So not only is it a 10-bit blur, but it also allows us to modify the blur both horizontally and vertically. But in this case, I'm just going to leave them locked and put that on 1%. Now you'll notice it's still a little overpowering, this blur. It's still a little too strong, even at 1%. But now we have the option, and what we can do then is drop the strength of the filter, the opacity of the filter, by 50%. So now we still have a blur, but it's only shining through at 50% of its maximum blur. So let's press OK. So I'm slowly getting there. Now I just feel like her jacket needs a little bit of enhancement. So once again, I'm going to go and create a qualifier. Three-way color corrector, drop that on. And once again, I'm going to use the auto color range picker, turn on my limitation tools, and enable a key. And now if I just click on her jacket, it's already selected quite a good key. So now all I have to do is just expand the range of that color. And also the luminance values of that color. Being careful not to select too much of her face, because her face does contain some similar colors. If I turn my key off, now I can change the color of the jacket and push in some more magenta. So we have some pretty advanced yet quite simple to use color correction facilities within EDIUS, which allows us to take advantage of both the raw properties of the file and add all the extra fine tuning in EDIUS. And just before I finish up, I will quickly add one more mask. Just that top right hand corner is a little bit too bright for my liking. So I'll just zoom this out a little bit and quickly grab this and rotate it. Soften the edge by 600, maybe 850, and once again put a filter in there, YUV curve, and I'll just lower the exposure a little bit. That's looking much better. Alright, so now you can see the benefits of shooting RAW, editing in RAW, and being able to develop your footage in RAW while adding further color corrections later with EDIUS's powerful tools. Now, I spent a number of hours trying to figure out the best way to send something out of EDIUS in 4K in a deliverable format. Now, generally speaking, when I work with 1080p footage, or even when I work on a 4K timeline, I'm subsampling it back down to 1080p like I was speaking about at the beginning. But in this case, we want to export in 4K. The workflow is 4K, right? So we start at 4K, we edit it at 4K, we finish in 4K. Encoders aren't as flexible as 1080p encoders are when it comes to 4K exportation. So normally I would export this in an MPEG-4 container, encoding it with H.264. So let me just show you the workflow that I would use for a 1080p export, but then I'll show you why it doesn't work and show you some workarounds to get a 4K export. Lots of people ask me, what is the best way to get 1080p to look fantastic but not be too big in file size? So I'm just going to render out this small section of our clip. So I've marked an in and an out point. Then I'm going to go File, Export, Print to File. Now if we choose QuickTime, and make sure Enable Conversion is ticked, but also make sure Export Between In and Out is ticked. So now I'm going to choose a preset called MPEG-4, and it doesn't actually matter which one of these we choose, because we're going to change these settings anyway. So let's choose that, go down to Advanced, choose Custom, and then change the frame size to 1920 by 1080. So remember, I'm going to show you the 2K version first. The aspect ratio, let's leave that to 16 by 9. And come down to field order, change that to progressive. We don't want drop frame, and let's leave the channel color as is. So if we click export, the next thing it's going to ask us is what do we call it. So let's just call this 2K from 4K. And we'll put it on the desktop in our nice little folder under renders. Let's try and stay organized, shall we? The save type is MPEG-4, but we still need to set some things up. So let's go into the settings of MPEG-4. Now, under video, we need to make sure that the video format is H.264. We have a container ending in file extension .mp4, but inside of the container, the compression is being done by H.264. Now the data rate is important. Now, something to think about when encoding your own videos is, most Blu-ray, Hollywood Blu-ray discs are encoded with H.264 between 20,000 and 30,000 megabits per second. So if we choose something like 20,000, that's going to be pretty damn good, isn't it? And our image size, we need to change that to match the frame size we chose a second ago. Frames per second, we need to match our project, 23.98. Now 23.98 isn't here, so we need to click on Custom and type that ourselves. And for keyframes, let's just change that to automatic. For video options, this one's very important. Make sure you choose best quality multiple pass and press OK. Okay, we're almost done. Next thing I would do is go to audio and change the encoder quality to best. Finally, press OK and press save. Now there's one thing you're going to realize and notice with RED very, very quickly. Unless you have a RED rocket card installed, which cost, I think, the last time I checked was over $5,000, but I think they've come down in price now. Without hardware performance, you're looking anywhere between 20 and 30 times real-time render times. After all that workflow, you still need to consider the render times of RED. Now this is the same regardless of what software you use, but it comes down to, if you want to render in the highest possible quality, then you need to wait that long unless you want to spend the money on a RED rocket card. But what if you want to create a 4K export? Now if you try and run along those same lines using H.264, you're going to get a compressor error. It's the same in EDIUS and it's the same in REDCINE-X. It's telling us that the current version of H.264 does not support 4K resolutions. So what does? So if we go to File, Export, Print to File, again click on QuickTime, but this time just leave it set on the exporter as QuickTime. Make sure Export between in and out is checked and make sure Enable Conversion is checked. Next up we'll go Export and we'll go to Settings. Now under Settings of the compressor, at the moment it's defaulted to H.264, and even if you change the frame size in this to be 4K, you will get an error and it won't encode. So what do? There's an option in here that Joey Coleman, thanks mate, suggested to me, and it's Photo JPEG. It does allow us to export a 4K compressed file. So let's have a look at how to use it. Now if we set this to medium, you're going to get a very, very high quality 4K deliverable. Now obviously you can set that much higher, but then your data rate is going to be through the roof and you may as well deliver in an editing format. We want to deliver in something that can be transported and copied and uploaded in a moderate amount of time. Now my experiments between low and medium give the results that medium is around 15 megabits per second, comparable to H.264, where low is closer to say 13 megabits, 10 megabits per second. Now if we leave it on low and we press OK, then we need to go to the size. Change the compressor native to custom, and if we go 4096 by 2160 and we press OK, now once again this is going to take a very long time. Now I did run into a problem with this Photo JPEG method. So even though we can get 4K export out of EDIUS, there seems to be some sort of gamma shift with that conversion that I can't fix within the settings. So there's the original, and there's my new 4K output. So how do we get around that? So basically what we need to do is lift the gamma before it gets sent out. So if we go to the effects, go to Wave V-Curve, and drop that on. Then you can try 30 times back and forth to try and match the gamma once it's been exported. Now, I did that for you. So I've created one here, which is Gamma Shift Fix, and I just drop that on. And as you'll see, the blacks have been raised. So now when I export this, same settings. And now let's compare the difference. So here it is here, 4K to 4K JPEG High Fix. And what I'm going to do is remove that filter that I placed on there to fix the problem. And then if we grab the layouter tool and I grab my cropping mark, what I can do is, as you can see here, as I slide across this dark area, revealing the new render, there are no gamma shifts anymore. So the colors aren't perfect, but this curve that I've created is a massive difference, and it's very, very close to the original timeline. Now this curve that I've fixed, this gamma shift thing, I'm going to put this in the download section of my blog so you guys can download it and apply it to your footage. So just quickly pimp my blog. If you go to www.mathsgotvisuals.com, and if you go up to the top right hand corner, we have a download section. Don't forget to check out my free 4K film grain, which is pretty damn awesome, and there's a complete tutorial that comes with that. But yeah, in the download section I'll also have that fixer YUV curve as well. I'll also upload this preset, which is very useful too. It's called a mega mask, or that's what I've called it anyway. And a mega mask basically has a mask, and inside of the mask it has two lots of combined filters within the inside of the mask and the outside of the mask. It's pre-softened on the edge, and basically it's useful because it saves you time, because when you open the combined filters, it's basically got everything you will need on the inside of a mask and everything you need on the outside of the mask pre-set in there, ready to go. So I find that saves me a lot of time, and hopefully it'll save you guys time as well. So that pretty much wraps up the workflow tutorial. The other step would be to export this as a high quality master file. This is pretty straightforward, I guess, but basically what I would do is create an in point and an out point of my master film. Then I would go File, Export, Print to File, Grass Valley HQX, which is a 10-bit 422 codec, and if we go Export, we can then choose Custom and go to Max. So this option will get you the best quality video file, master file, that you can get from EDIUS. So then I would just call this Master 4K Export and click Save. Now obviously RED takes between 20 and 30 times real time to encode, so be prepared for quite a long wait. But remember, once it's encoded, even at 4K, the HQX file will play in real time, and you can still edit that file as well.